welcome to this latest episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. I'm Ron Granieri, and all of us at FPRI thank you for joining us live on Zoom and recorded on the FPRI YouTube page. When shall I be dead and rid of the wrong my father did? How long till spade and hearse have put to sleep my mother's curse? Those lines from A.E. Housman's Welsh Marches should resonate with anyone who seeks to understand the relationship between past and present. The lament speaks to a common human struggle to decide what to do with the past. Is it a burden to lose or a constant life companion, something to be outgrown or something necessary for future growth as an individual or a society? For post-war Germany, even before national unification in 1990, the question of how history should shape political responses to crimes against humanity committed elsewhere was an increasingly fraught political project. The Germans talk of managing, working through, or even mastering the past with famously complex terms that have confused undergraduates for the last 50 years, such as Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung and Vergangenheitsbewältigung. But those who seek to find some finish line in understanding the past are bound to be disappointed. Saying never again is important, but deciding what you're willing to do to keep evil from returning, or even deciding which evils you specifically mean, is a recurring and complicated theme. Responsible wrestling with the past is a process without a clear ending. Success just means you get to keep wrestling, perhaps gaining some small amount of wisdom along the way. Our guest today, Andrew Port, wades into these complex issues with his new book, Never Again: Germans and Genocide After the Holocaust. Drawing on a rich array of public and government sources, including films and popular culture, Port traces German responses to the horrific events in places as diverse as Cambodia, Rwanda, and Bosnia, to see how Germans related those events to their own troubled past, especially in the vexed question of whether that past required a particular German response. In a subtle and fair-minded argument, he concludes, quote, finding a balance between too little and too much memory, striking a decorous tone that does not give rise to nasty recriminations and indignant rejoinders, learning from the Germans what to avoid doing. That is, perhaps, the most important lesson their admirable efforts to come to terms with the past can offer, close quote. So what does it mean to say never again? What, if any, responsibilities must the Germans shoulder as a result of their history? Can the Germans ever pursue a normal foreign policy? What would normal even mean? These questions and yours will guide us in conversation with Dr. Andrew Port. Dr. Andrew Port is professor of history at Wayne State University, a graduate of Yale and Harvard. He is a leading scholar of modern Germany, the author of Conflict and Stability in the German Democratic Republic, and former editor of the flagship journal Central European History. Dr. Port has won numerous prizes and fellowships in his career, including the DAAD Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in German and European Studies. And we are delighted to have him with us today on People, Politics, and Prose. Welcome, Andrew Port.
Thank you very much, Ron. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for that introduction.
It's my pleasure. It's been great to engage with your scholarship, but and to see you. Listeners might want to know that Andrew and I have known each other, if you go strictly by the crow flies, about 30 years, when we were both young people in the early 1990s. So I think you can put in the comments whether you think which one of us has carried those 30 years better. I don't know. But also I will say that we will speak for a bit, but we will open to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A feature for your questions. But Andrew, I got to ask you, what led you to write this book? How did it fit in with what you've done up to now?
What led me to write the book? Well, I guess there were very personal reasons for it. I grew up in an extremely secular Jewish family in Brooklyn, in New York. Not the same Brooklyn then that it is today. So, of course, the Holocaust and what had happened to European Jewry was always, a topic in our household. I remember the first time I heard of the Nazis, I was sitting with my grandmother and watching Cabaret. This must have been around 1971 or 72, and there's a scene where this woman opens the door and finds a dead dog on her in front. I whispered to my grandmother, who did that? And she whispered back, the Nazis. That was my first exposure to the Nazis. Fast forward about 20 years, and I wound up studying in Paris during my junior year abroad, and I met many young Germans there. And I also went to visit Germany for the first time that year. I went to Berlin, and I met many young Germans, my generation. And what really impressed me was how they engaged with their past, the really interesting questions that they posed, the sense of remorse about what had happened, really a willingness to engage. That really impressed me. At any rate, more specifically to the book, it began in a sense, actually a few years before you and I met. It was the summer of 1992, and I was in Germany. I think I was doing research for my dissertation. And that was when the reports broke of concentration camps, supposedly in Bosnia. The Serbs were setting up concentration camps to imprison Bosnians and Croats. And I just remember seeing these images on television and in the newspapers of, men with shaved heads standing behind barbed wire. And I couldn't believe it. How could this be? The concentration camps exist in Europe in 1992. And I was really interested at the time in how the Germans responded to that, what their proper response, what they thought the proper response was. So in a sense, that was the beginning. There were more recent influences. I took a little break from academe. About 20 years ago, I worked for the Human Rights Office of the city of Nuremberg. Books like Samantha Power's A Problem from Hell, Paul Berman's Power and the Idealist also had a huge influence on me. So,
right. Well, it's interesting because I think about this, that you started your career right as a journalist, which is very interesting, and then your first historical research was on the GDR. Right. And so the idea of, this decision to, what I think is interesting about this book that people will discover is you start out, you're talking about Cambodia in the 70s when there are two Germanys. And then you end up talking about Bosnia and Rwanda when there was only one Germany, or maybe still two Germanys. We could talk about that too. And I wonder, there's been a recent wave of scholarship about the GDR that talks about the role of human rights in the GDR's self-understanding. And I wonder, in what ways do you think the East German traditions have contributed to or shaped the way that Germans think about the past, or not just think about the past, but also think about their responsibilities when dealing with human rights in the present?
I wish I could say that it's had an important influence, but I'm really not sure that it has. I mean, I know that some important work's been done on human rights in East Germany, and I think it's fine work. I'm just not convinced that the rhetoric, obviously the rhetoric did not correspond to actual policies there. There was a great deal of lip service. My impression was that Germany's past, what it had done specifically to the Jews, was not really a major consideration in the GDR. It certainly came up when they reported about Cambodia in the late 70s, and they didn't report about Cambodia at all for the first 3 years, because it obviously wouldn't have made for good headlines in a communist, society to say that the Khmer Rouge were butchering millions of people. But when they started reporting on it in late 1978, early 1979, there were many, and this really surprised me, many allusions to the Holocaust and to Germany's past. But what I also found especially interesting was that the question that seemed to really exercise many East Germans, especially ones that we would call Linientreue, in other words, ones who were really committed, convinced communists, was how it had been possible for communists to have committed such atrocities.
Right. I noticed that in the chapter, you should talk about these films that are made about Cambodia. And then, of course, the obvious answer, if I'm a good, loyal communist, is how could communists do this? Well, communists didn't do it. Right. Because no true Scotsman, right? No communist would do such things. So anyone who does such things is not a communist.
Right.
I found it interesting, right? You talk about how for the East Germans, dealing with the Cambodia question was very much caught up in dealing with the relations between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. So you
Yeah.
blame it on the Chinese, which then allows, because that was the Soviet line in part, right? And so, but then within West Germany, right, to talk about the way the West Germans deal with Cambodia, there was, of course, the challenge, and it became a real political football. Certain people on the left didn't want to talk about it at first, because the Cambodians were seen as fighting against the Americans, get the Americans out of Southeast Asia, right? And you make a very interesting argument in the book about how that has become a common trope now, especially for conservatives who want to criticize the left. They'll say, "Oh yeah, you people didn't see you didn't want to talk about Cambodia," but actually, you point out that lots of people on the left and center left ended up talking about Cambodia as well too. How did West German society make sense of what was going on in Cambodia, and how quickly did they begin to speak in terms of genocide and concentration camps?
Right. Well, the first use of the word genocide, or German Völkermord, comes pretty early, but it becomes especially common during the one-year anniversary of the Khmer Rouge coming to power. So in the spring of 1976, you have many allusions to that term, not to the word Holocaust. Holocaust was certainly not a topic yet. It would be 3 years later when the Holocaust miniseries is shown in Germany. But when West Germans in the media, when politicians talk about it, there are frequently, even if they don't say it directly, allusions to what had happened in Germany itself. And I'm often asked the question, is that some sort of trivialization of the Holocaust? Because this is, of course, you're right what you said before, conservatives, and not just conservatives, many on the left as well, criticize those on the left who had been, marching in favor of Ho Chi Minh and the Khmer Rouge a decade earlier, less than a decade earlier. Now we're very conveniently not talking about what was going on in Cambodia. But the left, in turn, would, of course, point to conservatives every time they made that allusion, or this is another Holocaust, or again, that's a term that would come later, and say you're just trying to relativize the Holocaust and downplay somehow its the specificity of German crimes. But I have to say, I find that very unfair on both sides, because you really can't speak about political battle lines in this issue. Many conservatives and many on the left, many so-called progressives, in Germany, also made those kinds of allusions to the Holocaust. And you can ask why. Well, why? For an obvious reason. It was a way for them, I think, to express their shock, utter shock and anger about what was happening abroad. And given that by the late 70s, early 80s, the Holocaust is seen as, the most awful event in humanity. One can debate that, but that was the consensus by this point in Germany for many people. It wasn't surprising that they made those allusions. Again, to express their shock, but also at the same time, and I think this is really important, as a way in which to motivate other Germans, especially the government, to act.
See, and that's what I find it really interesting, because the way you talk about this and how that is a struggle, right? How do you make the comparison, because the comparison is going to hit, right? You know that it's going to, and yet how do you make the comparison without being without relativizing? You can be accused of relativizing, but without relativizing. Or how can you make the comparison without overinflating the problem?
That's the question. And I found, I guess I would say most generally, I didn't find much of an exculpatory or self-exculpatory undercurrent. I think that those who alluded to the Holocaust did it for the reasons that that I mentioned before.
Sure. And I would say the timing, which I find so fascinating, right? The idea that, as you say, when the Khmer Rouge first take power in 75, there's very little reporting coming out of Cambodia, and the information starts to come out by the later 1970s, certainly by the time the Vietnamese invade in 1979, and the Vietnamese then expose what they find. And this happens to be at the same time as West Germans are watching the NBC miniseries Holocaust, which I found very interesting, because I know that for lots of people who study German memory politics, right, this is a major inflection point when that television program is on, and that these are things that are running on. They're not directly connected to each other, but they end up being important at the same time, right? People find out what's going on in Cambodia at the same time as they're sensitized to the notion of the Holocaust. Yeah. And similarly, by 1995, the war in Bosnia and the Srebrenica massacre is happening at the same time as the Germans are in the midst of what you say is the marathon of historical memory that is 1995, with the 50th anniversaries that came up with it. And I guess that's a coincidence, right? Is that's the logic of history, or the cunning of history, or the sense of humor that history has? What do you think about how those coincidences can feed the way publics think about historical events?
Right. I think it's very difficult to say. I mean, one of the questions I was interested in is, how did the way in which they looked at these other genocides affect how they viewed their own history? And again, I think, you enter there into the realm of speculation. I think the way that they talked about foreign genocides was, in a sense, something that I call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, by proxy, dealing with the past by proxy. I think one of the clearest cases where it did have an effect on how Germans thought about their past was, perhaps surprisingly, the Historikerstreit, or the historians' controversy of the mid-1980s. Just some quick background for those who aren't familiar with this. And starting in 1986, a conservative German historian philosopher, Ernst Nolte, published an article in the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, Germany's leading conservative daily, and it unleashed a storm of criticism that he was trying to relativize the Holocaust. And there are good arguments, I think, on both sides, that that maybe his comparisons or his understanding of causality were a bit skewed. But what I found so interesting is that when I was doing research on this was that he had given an embryonic version of that article in 1980. And the article, it was actually a lecture he held in Munich, sorry. And that lecture begins by talking about the miniseries and the effect that it's had on German self-understanding and the media. And then later on in this lecture, he quotes at length from the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung. I'm sorry, he quotes at length from Neues Deutschland, rather, the
right.
East German communist organ. Who knew that Ernst Nolte would have read Neues Deutschland, right? But he quotes that at length. It's an excerpt from a statement that the Cambodians who overthrew the Khmer Rouge released, in which they detailed the barbarities committed under that regime. And that leads him into a again, one makes what one will of it, but an extended criticism of the left. Essentially, he argues that there are leftist traditions here going all the way back to the French Revolution. In a sense, something Simon Schama argued as well in 1989 in his book Citizens, where he talks about the Vendée, and he sees, I don't want to say a straight line to Auschwitz, but he certainly implies that. So to me, in a sense, the discovery of what happened in Cambodia certainly fueled that later debate, right? In ways that I don't think we can say precise. I interviewed Nolte many years, not many, but several years ago, before he passed away. I interviewed Nolte, and he said that the Cambodian genocide had not had an effect on his thinking. And, there's this old saying that contemporary witnesses are the worst enemies of historians. And, in that case, maybe it's true. I don't believe him. I think it clearly did. I don't think, again, and I really want to emphasize this, I don't think that he was using that comparison as a way to relativize the Holocaust. If you read what he wrote at the time, he became much more radical as this debate, ratcheted it up. But at the time, he makes it quite clear that he believes that, that the Holocaust was, I don't know if he actually says the most horrible event that ever happened, but he clearly is luckily very, very critical of what the Germans had done.
Well, and I guess that gets to that difficult question, going back to this whole issue of comparison, right? If you say something is so terrible it is incomparable, and you said, but here I'm going to compare it to this. But I also see this as a problem of language as well, right? Is that there's a reason why certain words take on the meaning that they do. Yeah. And we can't be surprised that people are going to use them to apply to other cases. So let's get into the related question, though, is, so what do you do about this? So let's say if there are big sections of the German public, there are leading German journalists, leading German politicians who say this is a genocide. And this is not only talking about Cambodia, but talking about Bosnia later on. Yeah. So this is a genocide. This is terrible. It's as bad as the Holocaust. What are we supposed to do about it? Especially we, the Germans. In what ways did the debate then shift into this question of we Germans have a particular responsibility? Is that responsibility just to identify and name the problem, or is that a responsibility to do something about the problem?
Right. In the case of Cambodia, that certainly did not play much of a role, right, for obvious reasons, right? By the time the Khmer Rouge were over, and nobody was getting involved anywhere in the world. The only person I can think of in the West who called for intervention in Cambodia was George McGovern, of all
people. That's right.
Of all people, George McGovern. But it certainly plays a role when it comes to Bosnia, and that's because of the changes in the 1980s, right? The greater awareness, the greater emotional awareness of the Holocaust, and that will play a role in people arguing that something has to be done because of our past.
Right.
Most people agree on that in some way because of the German past, humanitarian aid, taking in refugees, what have you. Where people argued vehemently about the lessons of Germany's past was whether or not that should involve actual, Germans and getting involved in military measures there, in intervention. And both sides use that history of the Third Reich and the Holocaust to make diametrically opposed arguments. The past is what forbade the Germans from getting involved in there, thinking also of what happened in the 1940s in the Balkans. And the other said, well, just because of our past, we have a duty to intervene. We have a duty to do something there.
Yeah. Well, and I guess that's the debate then ratchets up precisely because of that. That when people say it's a Holocaust, you mentioned these debates in the 1990s, right? Because there really is this discussion of if we well, and most famously, right, the example that I was thinking of, which goes back to the title of your book, is Joschka Fischer of the Greens, when he says, we said never again, we've said never again. You could say never again war, or you could say never again Auschwitz. And does that mean sometimes that you have to say yes to war in order to say never again to Auschwitz? And I know that was very controversial when he said it, and it became controversial when Fischer is German foreign minister by the time of the war in Kosovo, where you actually have what is the first red-green government, the first time the Greens are in a government position, they are actually embracing a NATO operation in Kosovo. And so and I think about that because I think about how that echoes today with the way that Annalena Baerbock, as a leading member of the Green Party and as foreign minister, how she's taken what had been a very strong argument among the Greens about Germany's historical responsibility for peace, and actually turn that into an argument for more decisive international action. And that this is an interesting internal debate among the Greens. It's also an interesting, I would say, generational debate, is how does one make one's peace with using, say, selling military hardware to the Ukrainians, or giving military hardware to the Ukrainians, when the party's origins lay in not wanting to have weapons at all.
Okay, well,
there's a lot going on there. I apologize.
Yeah, no, that's okay. You're right. Fisher, we tend, when we think of Fisher coming out in support of military action by Germany, we tend to think of the Kosovo War when he was the foreign minister, the first Green foreign minister. And that's certainly correct. It was the first time since 1945 that the Germans had been involved in actual combat missions. But as I write in the book, especially in the prologue, where I talk about Fisher's response to Srebrenica and his call for a international genocide clause that will force the international community to intervene when genocides take place. He frames it in that, as others do, in this question of never again war, never again Auschwitz. I find the dichotomy, I must say, a bit strange, because when you're never again Auschwitz is quite clear, right? We can't stand by and allow something like this to happen again. But when you say never again war, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that, okay, you're a pacifist because of Germany's past, you can never support military action? Yes, some people did argue that.
Right.
But the idea that the Germans somehow providing humanitarian support for an intervention in one of these countries, in Bosnia in particular, that was somehow an example or an instance of the Germans waging war again, just strikes me as, well, not a particularly convincing argument.
Yeah, I quite agree with you, but didn't stop people from making that argument, right? In the 1990s, right, there were people who were saying that the Kohl government's talk about helping in Bosnia or engaging in activity in Bosnia was proof that Germany was seeking to pursue great power politics.
Right. I understand the fears. They were especially strong on the part of, say, the hard left, you know, Gregor Gysi and Lincoln and you know, those segments of German society. And look, I don't want to dismiss their arguments. Again, I don't find it convincing to say that, you know, if a democratically elected government is supporting other countries who are trying to stop an atrocity from taking place, I don't see that as an example of the Germans waging war. I think it's just an abuse of history. I understand the concern, right? You know, that the Germans are throwing around their weight again, that they're, you know, some politicians, you know, argued things like, you know, we've been in enough wars over the years. But what I did find persuasive was the argument that they offered instead, which was that, okay, there are other ways in which we can make a difference here. We don't have to send troops. We can do things like impose economic sanctions, push for greater diplomatic efforts. You know, by the time Srebrenica happens, Fisher says, well, we've tried that for the last 3 years. It's not improved the situation. Now it's really finally time to act. And I would just add one last thing, since you mentioned Baerbock, the current foreign minister of Germany, who was also a Green, someone who was born in 1980, right, many years after someone like Joschka Fischer. I have been incredibly surprised by her take on this. Statements like NATO is the guarantee of our security, so we have to support NATO, which is really fascinating that a Green would say that, given that the year she was born, you know, then the Green was formed. That was a major pillar of their program to, you know, take Germany out of NATO, to dismantle NATO. So in a sense, you know, Joschka Fischer's arguments won out over time. This idea of never again Auschwitz being more important than never again war. But you know, I think it's in part a generational thing.
And the idea that you know, that Fisher, of course, is still around to continue to sort of polish his legacy in a way that perhaps some of the other early Greens are not. Connected to this. And I was thinking about is that, you know, going back, because I'm a history nerd, I read your footnotes and I see that you conducted endnotes. Sorry, your endnotes. Thank you. See, that's good, because that's counter nerd action there, because a nerd would point out that difference. You know, that you conducted some of the first interviews for this project in 2007.
Right.
And you know, all respect that you pulled the project together, but that means that you started this, of course, long before so-called Zeitenwende.
Yes.
And did you find anything different in the way people talk? Because I know you also had some interviews that were going on then somewhere, I guess, by 2021. So still not quite up to the Zeitenwende. What do you feel when and the book does have an epilogue which talks about the Ukraine conflict, but how do you feel the current discussion about Germany's behavior? Is it of a piece with the kinds of discussions that you covered in this book? Do you feel like have the Germans learned anything?
Well, first of all, chapeau on reading it that carefully. That you, I was hoping people hadn't noticed that my first interviews began in 2007, and then the next major batch was around 2021.
Well, you've been a busy manager, right?
Yes, raising two daughters and editing a journal for 5 years takes up a lot of time. But let me speak specifically to Ukraine, because that's where I did notice a difference after the Zeitenwende, and it's this. On the one hand, you have many of the same debates that you had in the 1990s, also in the late 70s, early 80s when it came to Cambodia, about refugees, for example, right? Bringing in refugees, allowing refugees to enter the Federal Republic. When it came to Bosnia, you also had the same debate that you have today about whether or not to supply the Bosnians there with weapons, right? Same debate that's going on today about Ukraine. Now, the major difference I see, and this I found really fascinating when I wrote this epilogue, and I was doing, reading up on the debates in the Bundestag and these open letters that had been published. What I found really fascinating is that the weight of the past doesn't seem to weigh so much anymore when it comes to how Germans talk about their own responsibility and actions. What do I mean by that? Well, there's a major debate when Scholz, the current chancellor, announces the Zeitenwende and the increase in money for the military and the promise of sending heavy weapons to Ukraine. There is talk about the Nazi past, but not about Germany and the Nazi past. Now the comparison is made to Putin. Mm-hmm. In other words, there are still Nazis in the world, but they're not in Berlin, they're in Moscow. And that I found extremely interesting. That was a real shift. Now, let me quickly add a that said to that. And the that said is this. Leaving aside Marjorie Taylor Greene and some of the more fringe debates in this country, I don't know of any country where the debate about sending weapons has been as intense as it has been in Germany. I could be wrong about that, but based on my impression, it's really been extremely intense. Habermas weighing in and others, and that fact, the fact that there's such vehemence and so many arguments about Germany about whether or not it's proper to send weapons there, suggests to me just how much Germany's past does indeed continue to count. Yeah. Also for determining German actions. Yeah.
But that also then raises that generational question too, because I think about Alice Schwarzer and Jürgen Habermas, right? These are hardy perennials from the 68 generation to a certain extent, and that they are in a sense, I guess they're being true to themselves in a way that, say, Joschka Fischer perhaps is not being true to himself, in the sense that he's the one who's changed and they're the ones that have stayed consistent. But I don't know whether is consistency a virtue when dealing with changing historical circumstance.
Yeah, I mean the generation issue. Habermas addresses that directly, right? Yeah. He says this generation is the generation that grew up with the threat of nuclear war and fear of World War III, and that is what is determinative for his take on that. And again, people like Bauerbach and this younger generation, which I think are now being called Generation 89 as opposed to 68, they didn't live through the Cold War. They didn't live through the protests of the early 1980s about the double track. decision to station new American nuclear weapons in Western Europe in response to the Soviet stationed weapons in Eastern Europe. So there I certainly see a generational shift. I don't really think you can talk about one in the genocides that I write about.
Okay, yeah.
And I would I'll give you one example of, I know that, you've written an important book on Konrad Adenauer, and you're very much interested in the CDU. Let me give an interesting example to show how I don't think generations played such an important role when it came to Bosnia. There was a young CDU parliamentarian named Stefan Schwarz, who was in his early 30s when Bosnia was taking place. And there was a meeting of the CDU in December of 1992. So this is a few months after the reports of the so-called concentration camps came out, the mass rapes, the first accusations of genocide. And in this, behind closed doors meeting of the CDU fraction, parliamentary fraction, Schwarz stands up and says, look, we have to do something there. And he points to all of the people around him who could have been his, fathers, maybe grandfathers, and says, if we don't do something here, what were you teaching us? What were you saying all those years about never again? If this isn't never again,
right?
So why do I mention generations in this context? One of the men sitting in that room was Christian Schwarz-Schilling, who was about 30 years older than Schwarz. He was born in 1930, so he was in his early 60s at the time. And he came out in full support, using the same arguments that Schwarz did, right?
Yeah.
From the same, right? That one of the lessons of the Third Reich was never again. We have to act, and he was so angered by the Kohl and Kinkel government's response that he resigned from the cabinet. He was minister for post and communication at the time. So again, I don't think you can talk about a generational shift from the 70s to the 90s. There's certainly more awareness by the 90s of German crimes and the Holocaust. Not to say they weren't known before the 70s. Sure. Clearly they were. But in terms of this the emotional register, the emotional effect that the Holocaust now had, that is a major change. And I want to say, add one, at the risk of going on for too long here, I just want to add one other thing. Just as little as you can talk about generational change, I think it's very difficult, and I think I alluded to this before, about political differences, because the arguments cut across political lines, and they make for really curious bedfellows. And I'll just give one example. There was a meeting, the Greens had a meeting about what to do in Bosnia. It was a public meeting, and they had a military expert there who, not a Green, I think he was from the Bundeswehr. I might be wrong. I think he was from the Bundeswehr. And he was completely against any military involvement. And one Green in the audience dared to raise his or her hand and disagree with that. And this person was booed, right? So
booed by the Greens.
Booed by the Greens, yeah. Most of them supported this, military expert. This, again, I think represented the Bundeswehr, because he was against getting involved, talking about Vietnam effect, or that kind of stuff. So I think it, we want as historians, especially as political scientists, we want as historians to be able to come up with, broad generalizations. But when you sink into the material, as I have, and as you pointed out, for a good 15, 16 years now, since, it's very difficult and unfair, I think, to portray these people in broad brushstrokes.
Well, I think that's a fascinating way to put it. And I will say Robinson Yost has a question about regional differences. And so this fits in with this discussion, right? We talked a little bit about East and West, but there was a character that you brought up in the book as well, Ernst Albrecht, who was the minister president of Lower Saxony. who, by the way, is the father of Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, which is, talk about continuations. But that Albrecht in the 70s and afterwards was a strong advocate for taking in boat people refugees, even against within his own party. The idea that people make the decisions they make and they take the positions they take, and part of it is how they define themselves. But it was interesting. You don't hear a lot of, historians of the CDU know about Ernst Albrecht because he's the guy who Kohl wanted to be the CDU candidate for chancellor in 1980. Instead of Franz Josef Strauss.
Strauss, yeah.
Right. But it is, and that he's von der Leyen's father. But other than that, right, he was a prominent sort of liberal Christian Democrat. And that was possible for
there on Christian.
And that's right. And that's what I would say is, they were serious about
really
that.
Moved by, and I don't think it was just lip service. I think that he really felt motivated. It was another example from that period is Chaya.
Chaya, right?
Who has a reputation as being a conservative firebrand, and he was, because of his work with the expellee organizations. At the same time, this was someone who went to great pains to try to help refugees, just like Ernst Albrecht did.
Yeah.
Did he do it out of the goodness of his heart? Yeah, in part. He also did it because of his own experiences. He had been a refugee in the 1940s, and this was not a Nazi. Whatever one may make of his politics when it came to the expellee groups, he was not a Nazi. But he believed that one had a duty to a Christian duty. I think he would have argued to help these the less fortunate. Now, that said, the fact that these were groups fleeing communist regimes certainly made Chaya and other conservatives more amenable to letting them in. When it came to, say, the Chileans from several years earlier who were fleeing Pinochet, that was a different story taking in those leftists.
It'll become a problem with with Bosnian Muslims wanting to come to Germany as well, right? Is that the issue of Bosnian refugees was more politically controversial?
Well, I don't know if that's true. Certainly, it was a much bigger issue because the numbers involved were much larger, right?
That's a good point.
Germany took in anywhere from 350,000 to 400,000 refugees from former Yugoslavia. And that was more than double all the other European countries put together. Yeah, I mean, it's something that's forgotten. And when we talk about Angela Merkel and her largesse in 2016, wir schaffen es, we're going to manage this. There is a history there. There are traditions there about welcoming in these refugees. The Bosnians, I think, are so important to focus on, the Muslims in particular, because of the openness to bringing them in. Now, there's been a recent debate among historians of modern Germany, a so-called catechism controversy, which essentially argues that that German elites, read German liberal elites, ignore the plight of other traditionally persecuted groups because they feel so beholden to their history and what had happened in the Holocaust. And the subtext seems to be that there's a great deal of animosity and xenophobia, racism in today's Germany towards Muslims. Okay. Now, I'm not going to deny that is certainly true. I've experienced it firsthand. I'm not Muslim, but I've experienced and seen it often enough in Germany to know that that's true. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge the fact that the Muslims were welcomed. They apparently, based on the research I did, could be wrong about this, I don't think I am, more or less experienced a warm welcome. Were not treated as interlopers. Yes, did Germans want to especially conservative Germans, want to send them back after the war ended? Yes, that's certainly true. But now I'm going to turn on my head everything I just said by adding this one important point, I think. And the caveat to that is why were the Germans so accepting of the Bosnian Muslims? Well, as they pointed out on numerous occasions, officials and in the media, these were westernized Muslims. For
European Muslims, right?
They were European Muslims. And for reasons of history that I'm not going to go into, they looked like what Germans considered to be European: blonde hair, blue eye. Maybe that's not a best example, but they wore sweatshirts, they smoked cigarettes. So there was, and they felt themselves also as Europeans. Some of them were shipped off to places like Pakistan, and they said they didn't want to be there. They wanted to be in Europe. They were Europeans. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, for those people who claim that the Germans are vehemently anti-Muslim, well, look, I'm not going to deny that there are certainly undercurrents in Germany critical of the Muslims. It's been throughout the West since Iran and Khomeini in 1979. But we can't ignore the other side as well. And that's, again, when I said before that it's difficult to paint here with a broad brush. You can't just focus on the one and not the other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and yeah, and this is that's a very important way to think about this, and the idea that as the Germans, as Germany, especially after unification, Germany is both taking on greater, let's say, geopolitical significance, but is also, the Germans are being told they have to take on more geopolitical significance. How has German behavior changed in not only sort of dealing, as Fritz Heinzen asks, about the relationship between unilateral actions by the Germans and German participation in multilateral organizations, right? Do the Germans bring their historical experience, have you found, into discussions in multilateral fora where the Germans come and say, listen, everybody, you want to understand genocide, right? Let me tell you about genocide. Let me tell you about what we have to do, right? How have the Germans handled that in discussions with their allies and partners?
Because of their past, the Germans are always very careful not to. In the field of economics, it's a different story, but they're very careful not to throw their weight around.
Right.
And it's very important for them to make it clear to those who say that they are somehow cowards, or they're shirking from their duties. They do say, look, you have to understand the role that our background, our history plays in how in our actions here. There was I don't want to do what's done in presidential debates where a question comes up and it's avoided. I think you had said that one of the questions was about East and West regional differences.
Yes, regional differences.
I responded.
Well, no, I mean, this is the issue of, we talked about the difference between the GDR and the Federal Republic. Do we see any kinds of persistent differences politically between residents of the East and residents of the West in dealing with questions of both of Geschichtspolitik more broadly, but also in dealing with what history requires the Germans to do with the rest of the world?
Yeah, I would say, because that was a question that interested me. To what extent, sure, after unification, do other differences between East and Western takes on these issues? And primarily in the book, I rely on public opinion surveys. Sometimes these Germans were more in favor of sending troops, sometimes less. Again, I don't think that you can. I really don't think that you can draw broad generalizations there. But I will say this: the most interesting conflict I saw between the East and West, again, came within the Green Party. In 1993, I believe, the Greens joined with Bündnis 90, the Alliance 90, which was an offshoot of the Wende. It was a group that was formed during the overthrow of the communist regime. And what's interesting is that the people who are in this Bündnis 90, Alliance 90, many of them, first cut their teeth on politics in the 1980s as dissidents opposing the regime. And they are much more in favor of acting in Bosnia than the old Western Greens are. And that I found really, really interesting. I had the opportunity to email. I wanted to interview him, but he would only agree to respond to my emails with Gregor Gysi, who's the head of the Linke, this far left party in Germany. And I asked him, I said, if he ever encountered anybody in his party who was in favor of sending troops to Bosnia. And he wrote back very laconically almost, no, I never
Really?
met
No, never.
Which is so interesting because you cannot say that of any of the other parties.
Interesting, yeah.
Any of the other parties.
Yeah. That issue of that these are questions that they get down to individual people's let's say feelings about history and about politics is fascinating. Now I see a question in the chat from a mutual colleague of ours, Tom Malucci, writes.
Hello, Tom.
Hello, Tom, famous another historian of post-war Germany. He points out that he's fascinated how in your book you talk about that the Germans did a lot of dealing with the past in the immediate post-war years, whereas the public, and I'd say a lot of other historians, right, they argue that people didn't really start dealing with the past until the 60s or afterwards. Do you think that we haven't done enough in our understanding of Germany in appreciating how much Vergangenheitsbewältigung was going on in the immediate post-war years?
Yeah, I think there's a misperception, and the misperception stems. Thank you, Tom, by the way, for that question. It's good to see you here. Yeah, I think the misperception stems from the fact that we scholars, but also the more popular take on this is that for the Germans to deal with their past, it means dealing with the Holocaust. And it is true that the Holocaust does not become an issue until the late 70s. It's 80s, 90s for sure, but until the late 70s. When I argue that dealing with the past, coping with the past, in fact, I think I even say in the book that there were never greater attempts to deal with the past than there were in the late 40s and early 50s. Clearly, I'm not talking about dealing with the Holocaust, other German crimes. What I'm talking about is making sure that the horribleness that just had happened, 30s and 40s, one can go back, say, to the 1890s, but in World War I, a real concern that never again happened. And if you look at the debates in Parliament about how to set up the Constitution, how to avoid the mistakes of the past, that's what I mean when I say that there was never as much Vergangenheitsbewältigung as there was at this point. What happens in the 60s, greater talk about, where were you in 42, what crimes the Germans, that is a change. That is clearly a change. And I'll just add, because a lot of people don't know this, I hope I didn't sound like infamous politician there, but a lot of people don't know this, but my impression is that the late 60s, when the students, the 68 generation talked about Germany's past, they also weren't talking about the Holocaust. They sometimes used it to describe themselves as Jews, that they were being persecuted, but there really wasn't an attempt by that generation to deal with that aspect of what the Germans had done. And again, that really only begins in the late 70s.
See, that I think that's a very acute observation, right? Because people talk about German crimes, but they're often talking in the 50s and even into the 60s, they're often talking about the war, or they're talking about, broadly speaking, sort of oppression at home, but they're not necessarily talking about the Holocaust.
Right.
Which is, we are reaching the point. I have one big historical question, then one practical question, because we're getting close to the end. My big historical question is, we're reaching the point where you pointed out that historical witnesses are the enemy of historical understanding sometimes, but it is an important moment when the historical witnesses are no longer with us, and events in some ineffable way, right? They shift into history for good when there's nobody around who remembers them. And we are at a point where the generation that fought in the Second World War, even children who were alive in the latter stages of the Second World War, are octogenarians. And do you think that the question of Vergangenheitsbewältigung for the Germans, for understanding their past, will it remain politically and culturally and socially acute when there's too much history in between, or when there are current things that people would rather argue about? In other words, will the Holocaust remain uniquely central to German understanding of themselves?
I'm not sure it'll remain central. And again, as I said before, the debate about Ukraine, I think, offers some evidence for that. It's there, but
Right.
it's not about us Germans, say. But it's become part of their DNA in a sense.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that is going to change. The shift that I see is kind of a more natural way of dealing with that past, being aware of it, but not always using it as a moral cudgel. Germans feeling a greater liberty to criticize others, including Israel,
Yes. Right.
and that, I think, with time is a major change. And I know what the fear is of so many Germans, but especially many people abroad, that the Germans one day are going to revert to their old ways. And there's always that kind of gotcha looking for the Germans relativizing their past or trying to ignore it. That I can't see happening. I'd be very surprised if it does. But I'm a historian. I can't predict the future. Who knows what would happen? But the Germans I have known and come to love over the last 3 decades, my impression is that it will always somehow be there.
Sure. Well, and then my last practical question is about the cover of the book. I find it fascinating, right? That the title is Never Again: Germans and Genocide After the Holocaust, but with these 2 redactions, we have Germans after the Holocaust. Is that intentional? What's the meaning of the
Well, how much time do we have left? Yeah, I've gotten many questions about this, and my editor, Kathleen McDermott at Harvard, she's really wonderful. When she sent me the knock-up of it originally, she prepared me. She said, "I've been looking at it for a day. Give it some time." I thought it was just fantastic from the beginning. My joke answer is, why is it redacted? Well, I had to cut about 100,000 words out of the original manuscript, so this was my attempt to get a few more out there.
Nice.
The fellow Ben Blount, who's a graphic artist who designed it, originally from Detroit, where I teach, Ben's idea was to cross those words out as a kind of anger at the fact that that promise of never again has not been fulfilled. And yes, it has that advantage visually of just leaving Germans after the Holocaust. But I was really so happy with the cover. The use of concrete, that kind of textured feel makes you think of the wall. The
Totally.
muted colors of the German flag. It's really it was really nice. I think, again, really inspired cover.
I have to say I agree. And actually, I would argue that the book itself is pretty inspired. And so I encourage viewers, right? The book is Never Again: Germans and Genocide After the Holocaust. The author is Andrew Ian Port of Wayne State University. Andrew, thanks so much for being here to talk about your book. There was so much we could do, but our hour is up. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was really a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Right. And thanks to all of you for listening in. Please, if you have enjoyed this conversation, please tell a friend and bring a friend next time. Right here at FPRI, we are always interested in putting together conversations like this on important questions. If you would like to support our work, please consider becoming a member, partner, supporter donor to FPRI. We are always interested in your support, and you can join the people who make programs like this possible. This conversation is over, but we will be back again next month, because we are back every month to talk about things in this world. And so if you want to know more about what's going on at FPRI, please visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. Once again, with thanks to Kayla Wendt, for whom this is her final episode of People, Politics, and Prose, and to the other folks at FPRI who make this possible. And with thanks to Andrew Port for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for being here.